All right, what's going on, everyone? Nick here again with Late Night Chess, and we're continuing our series in Queen and Pawn Endgames. So if you haven't checked out the first two videos that I've posted on this, take a look at them. I'll post the links below. But just recapping, so far we've covered Queen versus Pawn Endgames for pawns that are on the B all the way through the G file. And so we've learned a couple things, right? We've learned that if pawns are on the B, D, E, or G file, then those are going to be wins for the side with the queen. But if there's a pawn on the C or the F file, what we call bishop pawns, then those endings could possibly be drawn, depending on how close the king is to the enemy pawn. So the only other thing that we have to cover in queen versus pawn endgames are what happens if you have a pawn on the rook file, or what we call rook pawns. What happens in these positions? Are these won? Are they drawn? So let's take a look at a couple positions below, and we'll see that white in this position actually still has some stalemating themes and stalemating ideas, similar to when the pawns were on the F and the C file as well. So let's get right in it. So notice how black's king is very far away. It's not really going to be in the game for this. And white is one square away from promoting his pawn. So black really needs to do something here to keep white from promoting the pawn. And I'm going to show you why the typical routine that we studied, if the pawns are on the central files or the B and the G file, don't apply here. So let's pretend like black doesn't realize that there's a stalemate theme or a drawing theme here, and black decides to go about doing the same idea as they have with central pawns, which is trying to get the king in front of the pawn, and then once that happens, you bring your king forward to try and stop white's pawn from promoting. So black might play queen e7, and then the white king would go to g8, and then this typical idea of getting the king in front of the pawn, right? So black will play queen g5, and then king f7. So king f7 is now threatening to promote the pawn on h8. So the queen will come to h6, stopping that pawn from promoting. The king will come back to g8. Queen comes to g6. This should all look very familiar when we went over the central pawn, queen versus pawn endgames. And now white's going to come to h8. And now here's the problem. If black decides to move his king forward, it's stalemate, right? The pawn can't advance because the king is in it, and obviously the king cannot come out to any of these two squares because the queen is cutting him off. So black cannot make any progress in this position like he or she could if he was facing central pawns or pawns on the B or G file. So really, black doesn't have any other ways to advance. So for example, if he goes queen h6, then black just simply comes to g8, and you're just going to repeat this position because the white king is never going to leave the corner, or else the queen will be able to capture the pawn. Similarly, if instead black goes, say, queen e8, then this is still a draw. After king g7, this is the exact same position that we saw earlier after queen e7 check. The king will come to g8, and we'll just repeat the position. So there's really no way here to make progress. After king d2, it's simply a stalemate. So white really wants to try and hide himself in front of the pawn, and there's really no way that black can make progress. So that's a good rule of thumb for rook-pawn endgames when the king is really far away, when the black king is really far away from the action. There is an exception, however. It's not always a draw for black if the king is sufficiently close to the enemy pawn. So let's take a look at another position where all of the pieces are exactly on the same square as they are now, except the black king is on e5 instead of c1. So here's the new position, and interestingly enough, now this is a win for black. And it's kind of tricky to find a rule of thumb to be able to identify how close your king needs to be to the enemy pawn for this to be a win. But Jesus de la Villa, who wrote a really great endgame book called 100 Endgames You Must Know, I thought summarized it really well. So I'm going to use some of the way he describes it, which is, in this case, if the black king is 2 squares away from the key squares, and in this position the key squares are f7 and g6. The way I like to kind of remember that these are the key squares is these are the squares that a knight would be able to move to if the knight was in the corner. right? So that's kind of how I like to remember these squares is if I had a knight in the corner or if I had a knight in the corner here, what would the key squares be? It would just be these squares, right? So just kind of remember if my knight's in the corner, what are the squares that my knight can move to? And those are the key squares. So Jesus de la Villa's rule is if your king is at most 2 moves away from moving to these key squares, then black can actually win this position. So let's take a look at how this is possible. How can black win this position? Well, let's continue with the same way that we started in the last position when the king was on c1. So black will come queen e7 check. And now if white decides to go king g8 like he did in the last position, now instead of queen g5, there's a very interesting and resourceful move. If you want to try and find this move, feel free to pause the video. There's actually 2 moves here that work really well. But pause the video and see if you can find the way that black can actually win this position. Okay, so hopefully you were able to find the right move. It's a very counterintuitive move. There's 2 really that I'll show that work, but the interesting move is king e6. So this actually allows white to promote the pawn. So what happens? You might ask if white decides to promote the pawn to a queen. Well, then you have simply a checkmate in 1 move, queen f7, and the game is over. Alternatively, another move you could make, and this one's more instructive, and you'll see this in a lot of endgame resources, just so you can learn this position. It's an important position to know, is king f6. So if you recall, I just showed you what happens if king e6, but king f6 also works. And now here's the idea. You might be wondering, well, what happens if white promotes to a queen? Well, black can now move to g6, king g6, and this position is completely winning for black. Notice that white has literally no good moves. The white king literally can't go anywhere. The white king has no legal moves. And the queen can't move anywhere or doesn't want to move anywhere. It's essentially a zugzwang because as soon as the queen moves to any squares, black will have either a mate in 1 or a mate in 2. So obviously, for example, the queen doesn't want to come here or here or here or here. Or to this square, because the queen will just be taken immediately. And if the queen decides just to move out of this corner, say, I don't know, queen h2, for example, well, it's checkmate in 1, right? So there's really no good square for the queen to move to. And black has essentially been able to trap both the king and queen to deliver checkmate in either 1 or 2 moves. So this is really the key idea. And when you're facing a queen versus pawn endgame, and the pawn is a rook pawn, if your king is close enough, instead of doing the routine queen g5 like we saw in the earlier position when the king was on c1, instead do this very counterintuitive looking move, either king f6 or king e6, and now this game is simply over. Black is threatening this check, which is pretty nasty. And obviously, I didn't show this earlier, but if the king decides to go to h8, then you simply have queen f8 checkmate. And obviously, if the pawn decides to promote, then you still have a checkmate, except this time it's on f7. So just to recap, what can we take away from this? Looking back at the first position, if the king is far enough away from the action, then a queen versus rook pawn endgame is a dead draw. The idea is for the king to get in front of his pawn, and black in this case will be able to make no progress. However, if the king is sufficiently close enough to these knight squares, not this one, pardon me, g6 or f7, if black is at most 2 squares away from getting to those key squares, then this is actually a win for black by doing the very counterintuitive move king e6, or again king f6, which is a cooler looking move since white can promote, and you move to g6 here, and it's going to be mate very soon. So hopefully you found this instructive. Again, if you haven't seen the first two videos, I would highly suggest you post them. I think it'll make this video make more sense since I'm kind of going over very quickly some of the ideas and routines that I go over in the first two videos. So to end this series, I'm going to post one more video, and it's going to be a series of puzzles. Just like I did in the knight versus pawn endgame series, I'll post that series of puzzles. You can pause the video, try and solve them, and we'll go over each one. So until then, thanks everyone, and talk to you soon.